If any of you haven't seen this interview with George Groves on the Boxing Life Stories YouTube channel, I believe this is it Tris Dixon's channel? But Tris Dixon is the guy who interviews George Groves. If you haven't seen this interview, I highly recommend it. I found it fascinating and very insightful. George Groves gives an insight into the mentality of a top-level fighter. Not only the mentality in the ring, but the mentality outside the ring. He talks about a lot of the trials and tribulations he went through throughout his career, the relationship with Adam Booth and why they split, his relationship with Paddy Fitzpatrick, which is interesting and quite amusing. He talks about the psychological approach that he took for certain fights, like the Froch fights, the James DeGale fight, strategies that he employed in certain performances. He talks about the Edward Goodnecht fight, where Goodnecht ended up, sadly, with brain damage. Talks about the Callum Smith fight, where he capitulated. He went down on a knee after taking a body shot and some headshots, and he didn't get back up. And obviously he was called out by Carl Frampton, a former stablemate of his, for quitting. Of course, Frampton has recently called out Daniel Dubois for doing the same. So he talks about all these things in a very, very interesting interview. Now, just a couple highlights, at least highlights for me. He talked about his relationship with Paddy Fitzpatrick, because after they split, Groves spoke about Fitzpatrick in quite a contemptuous tone, and he never really provided any context. He never really explained why he was so, contemptuous in the way he was speaking about Fitzpatrick. But in this interview, he reveals that Paddy Fitzpatrick, God, how can I say it without triggering any kind of YouTube algorithm? Paddy Fitzpatrick is a very laid back and chilled out guy. And he likes his wacky backy. Let me call it that. He likes his wacky backy. And because he liked his wacky backy so much, it was actually, according to George Groves, interfering with his role as a coach. And Groves had several sit-down, meetings and conversations with him, trying to address this issue. And the issue just wouldn't go away. And that was a large part of why George Groves decided to leave Paddy Fitzpatrick, because of Paddy's love for the Leaf. So, yeah, it was interesting. Also, he talked about training in Paddy's gym in Swindon, which is an amateur gym, a community gym. And Grove said that he didn't like training there because it was full of just regular people. Whereas George Groves likes to be around champions. He likes to be around winners. He would go into Paddy Fitzpatrick's amateur gym, and Paddy's whacked out of wacky backy, according to Groves. And he goes into the gym, and there's like a 45-year-old, overweight woman lifting a dumbbell or something. And he's thinking, what am I doing here? I'm a champion. I'm a winner. No disrespect to these people, but in boxing terms, I'm on a different level to these people, So that's another one of the things that he didn't like about working with Fitzpatrick, is that he didn't feel like he was surrounded by winners. George Groves doesn't have the mentality of somebody like, Rocky Balboa, the underdog, the once journeyman, then turned contender, a man of the people. George Groves sees himself as an elite athlete. And I'm not going to say he got that mentality from Adam Booth, but he definitely shares that mentality with Adam Booth. You know, maybe Adam Booth helped to bring that out of George Groves even more. And he doesn't go into specifics with regards to why he split up with Booth, but there was clearly a personality clash there. There are clearly things about Booth's personality that George Groves doesn't like, and obviously vice versa. So yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of interesting insights. The psychological approach. George Groves is very calculated, very calculated in terms of how he would approach a fight psychologically. He wanted to do specific things to try and get under the opponent's skin. And in fact, Paddy Fitzpatrick, according to Groves, he was the one that came up with what Groves said to Froch at the press conference prior to the first fight, where Groves said he was going to hit Froch with 2 right hands. And the reason that Fitzpatrick came up with that, and he told Groves to say it at the press conference, he said, because when you go in there and you hit him with those right hands, and he sits down on his stool at the end of the first round, he's going to think, hang on, he predicted that he'd hit me with those 2 right hands, and it happened. So what else did he predict? Is that going to happen too? So it's psychological warfare. Again, very interesting stuff. Now, when Groves hooked up with Shane McGuigan, indeed, he said he basically followed David Haye. Not because he was so close with Haye, because him and Haye are not like bosom buddies or anything like that. But he knew what David Haye was like and the kind of people that David Haye liked to surround himself with. He liked to surround himself with winners. He had that same mentality. And so he was looking at different coaches. I think he tried out with Robert McCracken for a little bit, but he felt like McCracken's style wasn't right for him. But when he saw Haye go into Shane McGuigan, you know, he had his doubts about McGuigan because McGuigan's younger than him. And even though he'd worked with Frampton, he was still, you know, unsure. But when he saw Haye go over there, it was like, okay, Haye knows what he's doing. And if McGuigan's good enough for him, then McGuigan's good enough for me. He also talked about the, with regards to Fitzpatrick, the way his style changed. And it wasn't all just down to Fitzpatrick, because he was with Paddy Fitzpatrick for both Carl Froch fights. And in both fights, that was the typical George Groves. But it was his comeback fight, I believe against Rabras, was that his first comeback fight? Where you could notice a change in George Groves' style, where he was throwing more punches and he was less explosive. And many of us commented on it at the time. And this is one of the things which, particularly in British boxing, especially in amateur boxing in Britain, is not understood. Because typically in most British amateur gyms, the focus and the emphasis is on work rate at all times. You're supposed to throw 1 million punches on the pads, 1 million punches on the bag, keep your heart rate high at all times, work, 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 work. More punches, more punches. They think this is progress. This is not progress. See, people have got different physical attributes. People have got different aptitudes physically. So, for example, myself, I was never a person that was good at long distance running, but I was always a person that was very good at sprinting. I was good at sprinting, you know, 110-meter hurdles, shot put, long jump, stuff like that. Anything that required explosive, fast movement, I was good at that. You don't take somebody who's explosive, who has fast twitch muscles, who's able to produce high intensity bursts, far exceeding most other athletes. You don't take somebody like that and train them as if they're a marathon runner. put them on the bag for, 12 rounds trying to throw 100 punches around. You don't do that. You train somebody to their strengths. So if somebody is naturally explosive, if somebody is more of a sprinter, you emphasize that. You get those bursts to be more intense. You get those bursts that they fight in to be more effective, to throw the correct combinations in those bursts. Understand? Obviously, you do some endurance work, but you understand that that is not their strong point, that you're never going to, and by working on the endurance part of it and putting too much emphasis on the endurance part, you're actually going to start taking away from their explosiveness. And this is what George Groves talked about. This is one of the things he didn't like during the Fitzpatrick years, because going into the Badou Jack fight, I think he talks about not spending that much time with Paddy Fitzpatrick because of, Paddy Fitzpatrick's habit. So he spent a lot of time with his strength and conditioning people. And again, they were just focusing on these long, drawn out endurance sessions. And he said that took his punching power away from him. He wasn't as explosive. He wasn't hitting as hard. This is something people need to understand and emphasize. So, for some fighters, that type of endurance training is the best kind of training for them, because that's the way they're made physically. Like someone like an Antonio Margarito. Long endurance sessions, perfect for a fighter like him. But a guy like David Haye, a guy like George Groves, no. That's not the right kind of training for those guys. They're explosive fighters. They're like sprinters as opposed to marathon runners. So you got to train them different. And this is something Adam Booth certainly understood. So Groves eventually left Fitzpatrick. He joined Shane McGuigan. And he said Shane McGuigan was kind of like a compromise between the Adam Booth style of training and the Paddy Fitzpatrick style of training, where with Adam Booth, it wasn't just about explosiveness, but a lot of the time it was about one shot. I mean, in the interview, George Groves spoke about the James DeGale fight, where Adam Booth's strategy for that fight was for George Groves to throw hardly any punches. And Groves was kind of taken aback by that when Booth said that. Booth said to him, if you land 2 punches and he only lands 1 in a round, you win the round. So we're trying to win the rounds by a tiny margin. And again, Groves was kind of taken aback and unsure about that strategy, but essentially that's what he did, and it worked. So Booth, especially back then, he's evolved as a trainer, Adam Booth, and changed, but back then he was all about the one punch. Being able to get his fighter to have this devastating knockout blow where he could control the action, not just by using this punch, but by the threat of the punch. You could keep a fighter under control. So the emphasis in training was on putting maximum power into a single shot, into, repetitiously getting the muscle memory and the mechanics of the punch to such a level where you can produce incredible power in this one shot at a drop of a hat. This is what Adam Booth was, teaching Groves and David Haye, or working with them on. Whereas with Shane McGuigan, he's not quite so, according to Groves, he's not quite so frugal as Adam Booth, not quite so stingy in terms of punch output. He wants the punch output to be a bit higher than that. But he's also not like what it turned out to be with Paddy Fitzpatrick, where it's like a fitness session. It's like Box Fit or something. In one of these fitness gyms where they just get these keep fitters on the pads and get them to throw like 200 punches around. It weren't like that either with Shane McGuigan. It was kind of like a happy medium between the two. So yeah, a lot of really interesting stuff in this interview. Highly recommended. George Groves also talks about the ruthlessness that you have to have as a fighter if you want to achieve your goals. He talks about obviously getting rid of certain coaches and just being single-minded in terms of what he wanted to achieve. And this is obviously something which I've been advocating for years on this channel. I've been saying that there is no place in boxing for a fighter to be loyal to a manager, a trainer, a promoter, anything like that. Because they've only got a very small window of opportunity within which they can make life-changing sums of money. George Groves understood that, and his rival, James DeGale, also understood that. The pair of them understood that there's no use being loyal to this trainer or that promoter or anything like that. No, forget about that. You got to focus on yourself. You got to be selfish as a fighter. And I'm not saying that that should extend to your personal life. Not at all. Loyalty in a social context and your personal life is very important. Very important. But in a professional context, as a boxer, it might be different in different industries and in different businesses. But in terms of professional boxing, fighters don't need to be loyal to anybody, because it can often become a hindrance to you. So George Groves talks about the ruthlessness that he had to have at certain times in order to achieve what he wanted to achieve, the single-mindedness, the focus. And ultimately, he was able to make life-changing sums of money. And now he's happily retired. As you can see from the interview, Groves has been enjoying himself. Yeah, I don't know what he weighs now, but it's nowhere near super middleweight. So good luck to the Saint. He's actually getting all his tattoos removed, which is quite interesting. So anyway, that's an aside. I highly recommend the interview. Tris Dixon does a fantastic job. He also had an interview with Adam Booth a few years ago that was also very, very good. So yeah, excellent work from Tris Dixon. Highly recommend the video. Came out over a week ago now, so make sure you check it out. If you'd like to access all my boxing content advert-free and enjoy the convenience of listening via a podcast app with the option to download in high-quality MP3, then consider joining me on Patreon. In addition to the aforementioned perks, you'll also gain access to exclusive weekly live stream Q&A sessions and hangouts, as well as uncensored, no-holds-barred uploads which are too blue for YouTube. This includes my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Boxing Extra. There's no contract, there's no commitment, it's only £2.50 a month, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of hardcore boxing enthusiasts by signing up with me here on Patreon today.